see you. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I mean, we both live in Lisbon, but I can count how many times we had a chance to catch up.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And here we are, Money 2020. And finally, we'll have a interesting conversation because you've just recently made a move, right?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So whereabouts? So tell me more about what are you involved in these days?
So I'm currently the go-to-market lead for 8V,
Okay.
and 8V is a company I was born to aggregate instant payments on the online space for merchants, and now we are entering the in-store space
Okay.
by bringing those instant payments into stores through QR systems and making them interoperable across the world.
Okay, so there's going to be an interesting conversation. There's definitely certain things I want to pick from your brain, but let's start a bit broadly. So, what do you think? Because there's a lot happening, right?
Yeah.
I think over the last couple of years, we are seeing innovation from many different angles. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest shifts that you are paying attention to that is happening right now?
Well, as throughout my career, I have been involved in early stages companies, especially in Latin America in the most recent times. And the thing that struck me the most is what has been happening in Brazil with Pix, and the change that we are seeing happening throughout Brazil. How Pix has surpassed credit cards for the first time in history, and I think that the consequences of this across the world. Account-to-account systems, I think, are the biggest shockwave in the payments industry
Yeah.
at the moment. There's a lot of interest for them to at least level up forces with cards, which have been the dominant and still are the dominant and will be the dominant for a time. But for me, account to account, especially when you use more effective ways for settlement than SWIFT, such as stable coins,
Okay.
it makes it very interesting for the whole ecosystem to tap into this new movement.
So let's be more practical here, right? So we're talking effectively transactions that originate from a bank account going to another, navigating on which rails? The banking rails?
So it doesn't necessarily have to be a bank account, even though bank accounts are generally used as founding source. But in the case of Brazil, for example, it can be wallets as well, and it can even offline payments. As for rails, in some cases, yes, it uses standard rails when it's domestic transactions. But the interesting part of this is when you actually start doing cross-border payments with this, especially in currencies outside of the G10, where I experienced it myself to make a payment from Brazil to Mexico, and it was extremely complicated, slow, and full of friction. So we had to repeat it. There was a problem with some custom field. We had to pay again the fee. The corresponding bank didn't know where the money was. It Swift was a great system, but I think that there's better technologies for it, especially outside the G10, and that is where I think comes the interesting aspect of account-to-account payments, because they don't only remove participants and therefore issues in the transaction itself, but also offer a much better and faster and cheaper way to settle funds between different currencies.
Okay. So, in the industry, we talk a lot about alternative payments versus like the main standard one. So, do you see account to account as an alternative, or do you think this is starting to evolve to become quite mainstream? And of course, the nuances will be dictated by country to country customs. But
Yeah, well, like always, as you said, every country has its own speed, its own habits. I do think that account-to-account payments are gaining more and more traction, but they still have to catch up with all the products and all the functionalities that cards have. A fine example is the dispute process. They need to get there. They need to be able to offer buy now, pay later. They need to be offer installments, recurring payments. So there's still a lot of product that needs to be developed for account-to-account to level up forces with cards.
okay.
But I do think that as they keep gaining more product functionalities and adoption, they will keep growing and leveling. We saw that in Latin America. For example, right now you cannot think of going to Brazil without having Pix.
Exactly.
Boleto was so important. Yape is so important in Peru. Transferencias 3.0 is so used in Argentina. So we are seeing a lot of increase of share of these payments. But of course, every country will go. And to be fair with you, I think what we see in Brazil happening right now might be what we might be looking in the future, just as we saw in China with Alipay and WeChat.
Interesting. Right. Okay. And so when I put this then in the context of what is enabling or holding back then the success of account to account? So why is it not such a mainstream adopted? So what are the blockers?
Well, there's multiple nuances. When we see Brazil, why Speak's been so successful and fast, is because the central bank is the one dictating the rules,
Okay.
and the banks have to follow. Whereas in Europe, we have a lot of different countries and different central banks trying to agree on something, a directive that is only approved every certain amount of years. So the path and the pace is slower, and every country has its own nuances. I think what we are seeing now for sure is that there is a clear interest on governments and central banks in creating alternatives to card schemes. And certainly everyone is pushing and doing their best considering their own situations. But what I think nevertheless will be needed for instant payments to really be able to compete with cards is interoperability.
Okay.
If they don't work across border frictionless, they will not be able to compete with what for me is the greatest asset that cards have, their networks.
Yeah, and we just had a conversation, in fact, before this, precisely talking about the interoperability, which is probably the next thing that the industry is, focusing on solving. But do you think how far this is complex? We're talking about multiple regulation, multiple rails. I mean, isn't it a bit of an utopia somehow? Are we going to get?
Yes, we will. So as I said, there's a lot of forces pushing for this, and yes, it is difficult because you have different regulatory requirements, especially when we're talking about cross-border of opening the doors of a foreign citizen to the local scheme, and you have to comply with whatever requirements they have. But this is a little bit the mission we have in my current company to be able to do that frictionless while complying with local regulations. Nevertheless, there's a lot of work. But if you think about what cards do, it is even more complex than this. And they managed to execute this using SWIFT, using corresponding banks. So I agree with you, it's complex. There's a lot of things to do. I would not say it's a utopia. PayPal was a utopia when I first joined. Cross-border payments were a utopia in Latin America.
like
and
that.
look at it now. Look at
true.
PayPal. Look at cross-border. How many companies have been built on that?
That's true.
So I think it is monumental task. Yes,
It is.
but it's totally doable.
Okay.
I've seen it before.
Okay. I also want to pick your brain on two things that you mentioned in your introduction: QR codes
Yeah.
and offline. So let's set the context about QR codes, because it's been almost looked as an archaic, to my perspective, instrument here in Europe. What made this such an important, do you think, instrument to bring back into this age where we are very full steam into innovation? How innovative is the QR code?
It is not. I mean,
It's
think
not.
about it. It was originally invented for marketing purposes.
Yes.
I think it's a little bit of chance. I think it was a little bit forgotten in the back of the drawer of someone, and it's being utilized now. It does work great for this, but it doesn't have to be the final technology. I mean, we see also NFC start to be used in account-to-account payments, so it might be NFC. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how you transport the payment information as long as it's effective. QR codes are just a way to translate payment information and carry payment information easily, but it might be something different. It might be NFC, it might be a new technology that comes along. But yeah, it's a little bit like an archaic thing.
Yes.
To me, in a way, it's like SWIFT. It works great as long as you work with currencies that are tradable, but the moment you step your foot outside of that, it really becomes not useful, and you really need something better. If there is something better coming up than QR codes, I'm pretty sure the industry will adopt it quick.
No, I mean, QR code for me, it's interesting because in Asia, we've seen how this has literally, sort of the innovation has been driven from there. The offline context then, because we tend to forget that. A lot of the focus is very much e-com, digital, etc. but there seem to be an increased return to actually blend those lines. So tell me more about the opportunity you're seeing then, and what is the state in terms of the innovation in terms of that offline scenario?
Yeah, well, I think that um, online is always the most obvious choice because there's more. It's easier for the consumer to adopt, embrace new technologies, whereas in store it's a little bit harder to implement. There's more barriers, etc., etc. But nevertheless, as we said before, there's an interest by governments, central banks, and an entire world to create alternatives to the current status of affairs. Everyone is pushing for the account-to-account payments. Everyone is pushing for their own digital currencies to compete with stable coins. There's a huge race now to be able to achieve sovereignty when it comes to financial systems. In-store was a matter of time to happen because if you really want to compete and create an alternative to cards, you need to be able to be present in both offline and in-store.
Correct.
And we see now the first signs of this. Bizum in Spain is going in-store payments. Pix has been used for in-store payments, but a little bit like online. They're very young payments. They still need to develop more functionalities. Sometimes the implementation is not so easy, it's not available for everyone. So there needs to be this standardization that we see with cards to be able to really capture the market share that they will capture eventually. So for me, in-store payments are just something that has to happen.
Yeah.
But again, for me, the glue that puts everything together and makes it really a valuable product is interoperability, be it on online or be it on in-store payments.
Correct. And there's clearly, I think, a focus on that. And if anything, for me, COVID has actually brought that merging perspective, right? Because we shifted one world, but then the world got back to normal, and then the whole neglection around what's happening in the offline became really prominent. And I think there's really interesting experiences when you get the two working, together. And I see totally that this is, to your point, in terms of interoperable, it's not just the instrument, it's not just the region, it's also the actual channels and different outlets that they connect to. But that, whether it's led through A2A, whether it's led through QR code, NFC, you mentioned friction. People tend to see a tap less of a friction than scanning a QR code, right? So will definitely be interesting to see how you remove the friction aspect that is typically associated, right, with QR technology. But what is, aside from what your current focus is today from business perspective, what are the other potential trends and hypes that is around that kind of like attract you, or kind of you think it's worth paying attention in terms of technology developing infrastructures? And
Well, we hear a lot about agentic commerce.
Yeah.
And what's happening. I think it will have a certain weight on the industry, but I'm not so sure as humans are able to trust or to delegate this responsibility, because it's a little bit like the first time when we made online purchases on our mobile phones, and we had this feeling that something was going to happen and we were not sure. I think it's going to take time for agentic commerce to really become what everyone thinks it is. It's an interesting trend, but personally, and going back to the same topic, I think there's a lot of innovation around new payment methods, remittances, stable coins, better instruments to move money internationally. That is what interests me, where I see, there's a lot of friction. I see when I go to Brazil and use my card, how much charges I have to pay. I'm never sure how much I'm going to pay in the end. It's the same for Brazilians when they visit Europe. I think there's still a lot to be done on that respect to make it easier and more fair for foreigners and for us to travel and to use and to know what's happening with our money. Because, like it or not, we lose control of it.
Yes, yeah, no, totally. I think you depicted it well from the consumer, but also from the actual infrastructure, what needs doing there. Really interesting to have had this first conversation. So I hope the show goes well for you. Would definitely be good to have you back around, and certainly as things settle, would be good to hear more about the roadmap for 8B.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to see you.
Pleasure. Thank you, my friend.
Bye-bye.